So, good morning. We are now recording and officially welcome to our webinar for today. We are doing another HR spotlight, but for today, we are going to tackle strategic planning and some tips and tricks that maybe you can apply in your own planning sessions. We do have quite a few people who have not been with us before. So, let me introduce myself. I'm Elisha Corpus. You can call me Elisha. And I did my master's in human resources and labor relations at Michigan State University. This is why my work focuses on organizations because my training is in HR. After the master's that I took, I moved to Seattle, Washington, and worked with Microsoft in their global learning and development team. Over there, I was very lucky because culture transformation was the biggest thing happening in the company. Being in learning and development, I was able to directly be part of those transformation initiatives that encouraged employees to change their mindsets and behaviors. I was creating learning programs for 150,000 employees around the world, and it gave me a chance to see how planning and executing those plans can be so challenging for such a huge company. But also, I had the opportunity to realize that at the core of it, there are fundamental things that are important to planning and executing to make sure that the organization can achieve those goals. Later on, we are going to be talking about those essential things, and I'm excited to share my learnings with you. When it comes to what I do right now, I'm a management consultant and I have my own firm, very creatively called Elisha Corpus Consulting. So it's just my name. That's why you might see ECC as the abbreviation for some of our posts, or some people might say ECC. It's because my name is so long. So we just say ECC. What I focus on are cultural transformation, leadership development, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. I work with companies here in the Philippines and internationally as well. These free learning sessions, we try to do at least one every month because we love sharing the learnings that we get from the diverse clients that we are working with. When it comes to strategic planning, I don't believe that it has to be taken very seriously. I think it's a daunting thing already. So why do we have to make it even harder for the participants? That's why I love trying to put in my personality, or I love trying to put in things that might be interesting for the participants to lighten the mood a little bit. Kasi naman, di ba, bakit papahirapan pa natin yung mahirap na? So this picture was from a planning session that I did with it's a multinational worldwide organization, and they came here to the Philippines. So different people from different places around the world. We gathered in a hotel here in the Philippines, and they planned for the next 6 years of their organization. They also did like a stakeholder analysis. That's why I don't know if you've heard of that, like that meme with the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. So that's what we have there on the slide. I'll share more about those little tips and tricks that maybe you can apply as well as we go through our session. So, what are we going to do today? In this webinar, we will, number one, identify common challenges faced by organization in planning. I'm sure that you have had or have experienced those challenges. So, I'd love to hear from you as well when we get to that discussion. Number two, we are going to discuss the essential elements that help make a planning exercise effective. So ano nga ba yung fundamentals na dapat makover natin para at least yung basics of how a planning should be, you have those in place. And then of course, we have examples that maybe you can use in real life as you do your own planning in the future. I'll talk about little activities or tips and tricks here and there that you can apply as well. These are the 3 things that we are going to do this morning. So everyone, give me a thumbs up if you are good to go, ready to dig in. Great. Okay, we have a lot of people who have quick fingers. So, yes, keep that coming. Let's interact through the chat and through the reactions as well. So, jumping right in, I'm curious to know first, why are you here? So, bakit ba kayo nag-sign up? Bakit kayo nag-show up? What made you interested to learn about planning? I'd love to know if maybe you're directly involved in facilitating a planning or if this is something you're doing for your own teams. So maybe you can share a little bit more about that so I know why you're here and we can maybe address some of those concerns. All right, I see a first-time manager who wants to learn more. Great, thank you so much. I love that. Part of a planning team reviewing FY 2023 and planning for 2024. All right, so everyone, just so we're clear about expectations, this morning is not going to help you to do your planning right now, okay? So we are not going to ask you to create your strategies and goals right now. So this is not a planning session for you and your organization, all right? So let's just make sure we're clear about the expectations. Another thing to clarify is, of course, with an hour and a half, we don't really have time to dig into all of the details. So I'm not going to be giving you details of specific frameworks, but what I want to do today is to give you a big picture overview of what are the things that could make planning successful and effective. I'm going to give you that bigger picture so that you can do your own research and readings as you plan for your own planning. So later on, you'll notice that if there are specific frameworks or tools that I'll mention, I'll give you the name of it. If I have a resource, I'll tell you where to find it so that you can do your own research later on. All right? So great job, everyone. I'm glad that a lot of you are directly involved in planning. And then for some, you just want to learn more ideas to really prepare you for future leadership. So, why plan? We always have to ask ourselves that question. We have to know the benefits of planning. If you think about the reality that we live in, parang nakakawalang gana magplano, di ba? Who knows what's going to happen by December? Who knows? Maybe we have a bagyo or another typhoon flooding that will ruin a plan that you've had. We don't know and we cannot predict how geopolitics goes around the world. So if you really think about it, the world right now is very VUCA. So what is VUCA? For those of you who maybe have been attending a lot of workshops in the past, this is familiar for you. But let's define it quickly. Our reality is volatile, it's uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So volatile because the changes that we're experiencing, these are happening at a rapid rate. Just think about it. The amount of time it took for scientists to create a vaccine to the pandemic, that's an unprecedented, unheard of amount of time. So napakabilis na mga pagbabago. Think about the technology that you're using. We keep on replacing our phones because the technology advances so fast. Yun pa lang, example na yun ng increased rapid rate of change. The future is uncertain. We're unclear about the present and the future is unknown. So minsan nga, dahil sa dami ng nangyayari, hindi pa natin maintindihan kung anong nangyayari ngayon. Paano pa yung mangyayari bukas or next week or in a few months? The reality that we're in is complex. There are a lot of interconnected and interdependent factors. It's interesting because Nowadays, if you look at the studies from the big consulting firms and how they advise CEOs and leaders, you can see that almost half or more than half of the advice that they give is about being aware of what's happening in the bigger environment that they're in. So, ang pinapakita dito ay parang ang daming nangyayari sa mundo na connected lahat. And so even if we are working in just one company, we cannot just say, I'm going to just pay attention to my organization. We also have to be able to look up and see what is happening in the field, in the industry, in the country, in the world that might affect your organization and its goals. The reality that we live in is ambiguous. There's a lack of clarity on events, and people may have multiple truths. It's interesting because nowadays in the world, it's even hard sometimes to find the common truths or common facts that people believe in. We see that happening in a lot of countries, especially, for example, the United States, where we're really hearing the differences in opinions of people. So yung reality natin is buka. That's why it's hard to plan, because we have to plan in the context of this reality. Sometimes it might feel as if we are building that plane, rebuilding that plane, while we are already flying. The thing that makes it even harder is there's not one person who has all of the solutions or all of the parts to build that plane. Every person, every unit, every department, we all have different parts that make the plane whole. That's why I love this picture, because it's such a great depiction of how it can be so challenging to be working in organizations nowadays. So beyond all of that, bakit nga ba nagpaplano pa rin tayo kahit na ang gulo-gulo and hindi naman natin maprepredict yung mangyayari? We plan because planning encourages reflection to go back to fundamentals. If you think about the busyness of every day, maraming leaders, wala silang time to sit down and to really think about, are we still doing things that are worth it? Are we still providing value to our customers? Okay pa ba yung business ko? Diba? Kapag ang dami nating problema sa trabaho na ginagawa araw-araw, there's not time that a lot of leaders can find to sit down and think through these fundamental questions. When we do planning exercises, it's usually a forcing function, especially for leaders, to go back to fundamentals and ask themselves the question, are we still doing the mission and the vision that we set out to do? Are we still providing value? Have we lost our identity, or do we still know who we are and our competitive advantage? Ito yung mga bagay na pwede nilang maisip when they are given the chance to plan. Another benefit is that planning encourages taking a systems approach. Again, when we're so busy with our own work, it's tempting to just care about our own team, our own unit, our own department. Diba? As long as tayo nagagawa natin yung goals. So bakit ka makikialam dun sa kabilang department? But when it comes to planning, usually this is a unique time in the year when the different departments and teams come together and hear about what is happening in their worlds. It's very important to be able to do that because it makes people realize that it's a system, it takes a system for the organization to work. Hindi pwedeng yung sarili mo lang na team ang iisipin mo because everyone affects the whole system. Planning trains us to have that approach. Benefit number 3, planning encourages adherence to a process, and that process could influence future decision making. When we train ourselves to know na may proseso ang mga bagay na kailangan natin pagdesisyonan, nasasanay tayo na ganun yung behavior. What usually happens with organizations is we tend to want to find the shortcuts. Siyempre, di ba? Because ang dami nating ginagawa, and if may shortcut, baka mas mapabilis if gawin natin yun. The thing about planning, though, is it tells us that there's a process to everything, and that process contributes something positive to the organization as a whole. So planning really makes us realize that we have to follow the process, even if at times it makes our work more tedious. Planning also encourages communication across teams and departments. It's a forcing function that makes people talk to each other. It's actually interesting because whenever I do planning workshops, meron akong naririnig talaga ng mga tao, sasabihin nila, wow, ngayon ko lang siya nakita or hindi ko kilala yung tao na yon. And this also happens in small to medium-sized companies. So if you can just imagine, 100 lang sila dun sa company, but there are people they've never met or they've never talked to. So then a planning exercise encourages people to cut across those hierarchical lines so they can talk to each other and learn from each other. And then last, and I think one of the most important benefits of planning, is it encourages accountability and participation at the individual level. When we create goals and put actions to those goals, kailangan alam natin kung sino ang gagawa nun and kung by when niya kailangan gawin yun. So, kailan yung mga milestones dapat mangyari. Planning helps us identify those so that once you have your plan in place, you can just follow it, revisit, and revise if needed throughout the year. So these are the benefits of planning that I hope we can keep in mind. As we go through our year, you're always going to hear people who will say that planning is so tedious, so tiring. Sometimes parang sasabihin nila, hindi naman useful yan kasi pabago-bago nga yung plano. But what I hope is that you can now explain to them that it's not just about the plan per se. It's also about the change in behavior and the change in process that people learn from the planning. So now let's dig into what is this planning that we've been mentioning. So let's define it first. The thing about that, though, is there seems to be a variety of definitions and models when it comes to planning in general or strategic planning specifically. What do we mean by this? Minsan, for example, may magsasabi sa akin na client, we need your help for a planning. And then if I start asking them, do you want a strategic planning or is it more of an operational planning? Tapos, hindi na nila alam yung difference, di ba? Kasi nga, iba-iba yung definition na alam ng mga tao. Even in the literature, if you look at popular articles, for example, different researchers may have different conceptions of the leveling of planning. That's why it's a little bit hard and challenging. So here's what we'll do. We are going to look at the most common aspects of the definitions. The source that I'm using here, if you'll notice, so look at the lower right side of the screen. The source is kind of old. Diba? Medyo luma na siyang source if you think about it. There's this book, it's called Strategic Planning, What Every Manager Must Know, and it was written way back in 1979. So if you want to do more reading on strategic planning, I think it's still a pretty good book. So syempre may mga bagay na outdated na, but if you want the fundamentals, then something classic might be good. So let's look at the definitions from let's not say old, from a classic book. All right? So, strategic planning, it deals with the futurity of current decisions. Ibig sabihin lang yan, ginagawa natin yung planning to look at the chain of the cause and effect consequences of our actions and decisions. Iniisip natin kung ano ba yung pwede mangyari, and pag ginawa ko ang isang bagay, paano nun maaapektuhan yung nangyayari sa organization. Strategic planning is a process. It usually begins with setting organizational goals, and then defining strategies, and then developing detailed plans and reviewing them. I think this is an important part of the definition. As you research later on, may mga tools na magdadagdag pa sila dyan. May tools na iba pa yung goal sa objective. Iba pa yung goal, objective sa strategy. Tapos dadagdagan nila ng measure and target. Magkaiba yung measure at target. Iba pa yung output. Iba pa yung impact. So as things get more complex and detailed, there are tools that will be harder. My advice, though, is when things get overwhelming, always go back to fundamentals. And as we see here in this definition, as long as you define the goals, the strategies, how to get those goals done, and then do some detailed plans of actions and accountabilities, kahit yun lang, meron ka nang mararating dun sa planning mo. Sometimes it doesn't make sense for teams and organizations to use the complex frameworks. And so maybe think about this definition and the simplicity that it recommends here. Strategic planning is a philosophy. So at the end of the day, it's a thought process. Yes, the models, the tools, the systems, those are important and those are useful. But we do planning because we want people to get used to that thought process. Logic kasi siya. Ang planning exercise, ini-exercise mo yung logic mo to say na if situation A happens, ano yung mga bagay na pwedeng consequence nun? And then what do I do to deal with that? So it trains your brain to think in a logical way. That's why it's a philosophy, because we want people to practice and instill that way of thinking. And then, of course, last definition is strategic planning is a set of interrelated plans. Strategic planning, it links strategic plans, operational plans, budget plans across the organizations, units, or departments. So later on, let's define what those different kinds of plans are. To summarize all of that, we can say that strategic planning is the systematic and more or less formalized effort of a company to establish basic company purposes, objectives, policies, and strategies, and to develop detailed plans to implement policies and strategies to achieve objectives and basic company purposes. Let's explain that, di ba? I-breakdown natin kasi parang paulit-ulit lang yung sinasabi niya. Parang paulit-ulit yung sinasabi niya because we want to emphasize here the cyclical nature of planning. If you think about it, you plan para magkaroon ka ng mga strategy, policy, and ma-define yung purpose. Pag nagawa mo yun, then meron ka ng objectives and purpose. Tapos, pag nag-planning ka ulit sa susunod na taon, yun yung i-review mo. So all this says is it's a cyclical process that you need to undertake when it comes to planning. All right? So we've defined strategic planning. Now, there are other types of planning that you will hear about. Like what I said earlier, minsan may clients who will tell me na gusto namin ng strategic planning. But after I ask them for more information, it turns out what they want pala is operational planning na per unit. So mas detailed. So I think it's good for us to define this a little bit. Strategic planning is the broad and long-range goals. Usually, it's the top leaders, your senior leadership team, your MANCOM that sets these. Tactical planning, it's identifying more specific, shorter range objectives, usually lower level managers, yung mga middle managers. Operational planning, now you get into the unit or team level, and it's setting of the work standards and schedules. And then there's also contingency planning, where you look at some backup plans in case your primary plans fail. Now, like what we've been saying, hindi laging pare-pareho ang definitions. So I'm going to tell you that in real life, honestly, what I observe is most companies will just combine tactical and operational. So yun yung na-observe ko usually, na iisa na lang yung tactical at operational nila. What I also observe is that most companies, they fail to do contingency planning. So yun na yung hindi nagagawa, all right? You might be more familiar in your companies if you do strategic plans, operational plans. So kaya gusto lang natin i-define so that you know what you're talking about and you're able to dig in and ask more questions in the future when you hear these terms. All right. So again, there seems to be a variety of definitions and models. Yun yung isa sa mga bagay that makes planning challenging, na iba-iba ang pagkakaintindi ng mga tao. So now, let's look at the other challenges when it comes to planning. For those who have not yet answered the Mentimeter, I'm going to paste the link in the chat and you can still do that. And then for the others, I think we do have a pretty good number of answers there. So let's review and look at what you all said. So the first statement was, I can confidently state my company's goals for the next 3 years. It looks like medyo a little bit above average lang yung sagot ng mga tao. That's actually one of the challenges. After planning, nagkakalimutan na. So hindi na ma-articulate ng mga tao kung ano ba yung plinano nila nung planning. The second statement is, we revisit our team's plans more than once a year. It's also just a little bit above average. I can tell you this is very common for a lot of teams. The planning just happens either December or January, and then they maybe revisit it mid-year. Tapos annual planning na ulit. So hindi talaga siya natitingnan. And then the third statement here is, it is difficult for my team and I to find time to do formal planning exercises. So this is reverse coded, by the way, if you notice. So ang ibig sabihin ay, pag mas mababa yung score, then people are saying that it's not hard for them and they are able to find time. So it looks like for maybe a little bit close to half of you, you're saying na nakakahanap naman ng time for formal planning in teams, which is good news, right? I think nowadays, especially with the popularity of planning, mas nagiging normal na nga siya. I've also seen a lot of companies that combine planning with other activities. So maybe that's why organizations are able to find more time for that. So let's go and review. Ano nga ba yung challenges in planning? We've already said that there's a lack of common understanding on the plan to plan for and how to plan. So what do we mean by this? Minsan, hindi rin aligned yung leaders kung ano ba yung kailangan nila. I've encountered this for some clients where maybe the managers, the lower level managers, they'll say, you know what, we need a strategic planning because I think we're not providing value to our clients anymore. And then you talk to the CEO and the CEO says, hindi, may mission vision pa naman, applicable pa yan, operational planning lang kailangan. So minsan, dun pa lang, hindi na sila nagkakaintindihan kung ano yung kailangan pagplanuhan. Other challenges, there could be resistance to change. During planning, different decisions are made, which means changes happen. And people might fear the change in power dynamics, decision making, and the change in the flow of information. Just think about it. When new projects get approved, pwedeng mag-iba-iba yung configuration of teams. Pwedeng mag-iba-iba yung priorities. Maybe your project might get deprioritized. So sometimes that feels like, hindi na ba importante yung ginagawa ko? Mas importante ba yung iba? So these are just some of the interpersonal challenges that we can encounter in planning. Planning could surface some quote-unquote hidden conflicts. So pwedeng sa buong taon, ginagawa lang ng mga tao yung minimum na kailangan nila gawin. But once we get into planning to talk about what happened during the year and how we can improve it for the next year, pwedeng lumabas na yung mga hindi nila, things that they don't see eye to eye on. Another challenge is not setting big goals for fear of failure. If the purpose of strategic planning is to look at the big goals, the long-term goals, then we have to kind of be a bit risky in terms of setting those. The trick is to try to figure out what is the right level of balance between big goals that are motivational and challenging versus big goals that are so impossible, people just feel helpless against them. Another challenge is dadami yung trabaho. I think this is the most common one and I don't know if you can relate. Pero pag nagpa-planning, dumadami yung action items. Kaya dumadami yung trabaho na kailangan gawin. And it's not a good feeling, right? To see that it's overwhelming the things you have to do. And then another challenge is that people may question the value of planning. So now that we know these challenges, how do we start solving for them? If we look at the essential elements of strategic planning or some planning in general, there are fundamental things that have to be present so that we can start addressing those challenges. Something to note here is that a one-size-fits-all model for planning does not exist. Kaya hindi ako magbibigay ng model today. I'm only going to give some examples because even if I give you one model that I like to use, pwedeng hindi siya applicable for you. So the best is to understand the fundamentals. Pag naiintindihan mo yung fundamentals, pwede mo na i-modify yung planning tools in terms of addressing the need of your own team. So that's why let's look at yung fundamentals, yung essential elements. The best planning exercise is customized to target the needs of your organization. So what are those elements that could help you to figure out kung ano ba yung dapat gawin? First essential element is clear intent. You have to ask yourself, is the organization or the team, so just think about what level applies to you, is the team or organization looking to reassess core elements of the business? If yes, then most likely, strategic planning is what you're looking for. What do I mean when I say core elements of the business? Core elements of the business, think about it as yung identity mo as a company. For example, these are things like, what is your mission? What is your vision? What is your purpose? What are the values that you adhere to as a company? What is your competitive advantage that other companies cannot copy from you? What value do you provide to your clients or to your customers? Bakit nila kayo hinahanap? So these are the core elements of the business. If the organization is looking to make detailed plans that can guide units or departments for the year, so mas operational planning siya. In this sense, the company doesn't need to reassess or to revisit those core elements, but they want to make sure that every unit, every team, every department, they're all aligning to those core elements of the business. The intent is important because it will influence the activities and the outputs from the planning. Hindi pwedeng hindi malinaw kung ano yung purpose ng planning because that will influence kung ano yung gagawin nyo. Now, based on my experience, what I noticed is that a lot of companies prefer to do a sort of combination of both. So I'll give you an example. Maybe because, let's say, for example, if a company just recently revised their mission vision. So hindi naman nila gustong baguhin, pero gusto nilang i-review. So then my elements pa rin of strategic planning and then my operational planning as they do the detailed plans. So what I notice now is a lot of companies sort of want a hybrid of the two. That's why it's even more important to be clear kung ano ba yung intent para masusolusyonan mo yung mga ganong requests. Essential element number 2. We need to have a defined involvement of the key people. So ask yourself, who will be in the planning committee? I think it's very essential that there's at least one person or even a team of people who are dedicated to making that planning happen. Bakit? Because before pa mangyari yung planning workshop, maraming kailangan i-prepare. If you do not have a team or a dedicated person preparing that, you run the risk of everyone showing up to the planning workshop not ready and not knowing what to do. Ang daming time na nawi-waste pag ganun. So very important that you have a dedicated planning committee. Next, ask yourself, who are the participants going to be? Think about at what level of conversations you want to be having. Most of the time, if strategic planning, you'll only need the highest level leaders. If it's operational planning, probably the heads of the departments or the units. So that's the usual process. Nowadays, because companies want to be more participatory, and I think it's something to applaud actually, mas madami nang ini-invite minsan sa planning. I've had plannings for smaller companies, for example, na lahat ng employees nila kasama. Even yung, let's say, sanitation, janitorial staff, sinasama nila sa planning. I think that's okay. Again, there is no set rule when it comes to planning and how to do it. What's important is, dapat clear tayo kung ano yung role ng bawat tao na i-invite dun sa planning. You can invite everyone in the organization, but you have to be specific about why you're inviting them and what insights and input you want to learn from them. That's why you included them in the planning. Next question, ask yourself, who's going to gather the data needed for analysis? There's a lot of data that you'll need to prepare for planning. Bakit? Because in planning, you have to have an understanding of the current reality and the results of the organization or the team that you're in. Results mean you need data. That's why it's important to understand kung kaninong responsibility yung data gathering. Is there a dedicated team that has a database of all the data? Does the data lie in different documents in different teams? And if so, paano natin makukuha lahat yan? So these are the meticulous questions that you have to ask and prepare for before the planning even happens. Who will communicate to participants? So sino yung magbibigay ng instructions and who will make sure that everyone is aligned even before going into the workshop? Who will handle documentation and organization of knowledge? Planning can be one of the most overwhelming in terms of the amount of information you're trying to consolidate. So dapat alam natin kung sino ba yung mag-handle ng organization of all of that. Another question is, which leaders in the organization will have to be the most involved? So within the leadership team that you also have to identify sino ba yung pwede maging sponsor for the planning. Who are the individuals who believe in planning, or maybe they seem to be the most interested in planning, so you can enlist them as sponsors. Important yun because they can convince their fellow leaders, other higher up people in the organization, that the planning is important and they have to actively participate. So para ka lang humahanap ng someone who will back you up as you get the leaders to discuss and plan. So that's essential element number 2. Before we get into number 3, I'm curious to know, everyone, maybe just estimate in terms of days, how much time does your team allot for planning? So let's see, like I'd love to know what's your interpretation of that. Ano yung estimate nyo in terms of your observation? And again, no right or wrong answer, di ba? Kasi sabi natin, it depends on your team and the need. So type it in the chat. Okay. Oh, so some people do like a kind of hybrid. Yes, maybe 2 days on site, 1 day on Zoom, 1.5 days for some senior level leaders. Oh, interesting. May mga half day na gagawa nila. All right. It'd be interesting to know at what level yung planning na half day, no? Okay. Some people are saying just-in-time planning. All right. So it seems like in your organization, kasama na siya sa routines. That's good to know. All right. This is very common as well. Yung 2 days planning, 1 day team building. That's a common model I see also. All right. So I ask all of you that question because I want us to start shifting our mindset about this. Usually, pag sinabi nating planning, ang iniisip lang ng mga tao is yung workshop mismo. So yung 2-day, 3-day, 4-day workshop, whatever that is. So now that we're here, maybe we can start thinking about planning as that whole process of before, during, and even after the planning workshop. Before the workshop even happens, there has to be pre-work. So you have to ask yourself, gusto ko ba mag-assign ng pre-work? And if so, how much of the plan would you want participants to already come in with? There are some companies na pagdating nila sa workshop, ang expectation ay may document na per unit or per team. Tapos presentation na lang, and then discussion and revision. For some companies, they want to actually give time so that the managers sit down and then make their plans during the session. So in that case, what I do as a facilitator is I just give them guide questions beforehand para hindi starting from scratch when they come into the workshop. So here's one of my suggested time frames in terms of planning for your organization. Again, it depends on the need of the organization, how big it is, the industry cycle, etc. So just take it with a grain of salt, and this is just something to give you an idea. Usually, we recommend that by September, dapat nag-evaluate ka na. Nagawa ba namin yung mga plinano namin this year? How are we doing in terms of performance? Are we hitting our targets? So it's good to do that in September, even if the year has not ended yet. It'll give you an idea of how far away from you or how far away you are from your targets. So then by October, because the leaders already have an idea of how things are going, then the leaders can discuss and set the overall goals and direction. What we want is for them to really think about, given what we know so far, where do we want to take the company next year? What are those priorities that we have to take note of? Kaya buong October yan because I'm sure as you all know, when it comes to leaders, madami pa yung discussion, di ba? Na pabalik-balik, paulit-ulit. And that's actually good because then you want them to really dig into what those goals might be. In November, it would be good if this is when the managers, the leaders, they can do the operational and budget planning per unit and department. If alam na nila yung big picture, overall company goals and direction, then they can align their own unit or department to that. And then by December, ideally the first few weeks of December, kasi wala nang nagwo-work pag last few weeks of December, di ba? So ideally, first few weeks of December, you do some sort of planning session, ito na yung workshop, para you put everything together. Some companies call it budget defense, where they defend the budget they've set for the year. Some companies, they don't say budget defense, it's more of planning presentation. So it really depends on what you call it. But ideally, dapat it's time to put everything together. All right? So then by January, approved na yung plans. And then now, you just have to communicate those final plans and people will just keep on going, revisiting and revising as they go along. So this is just a suggested time frame. Again, we are talking about this because we want people to start realizing that planning isn't just the workshop that they do. It's really this process that happens at different points throughout the year. All right, that's essential element number 3. I see a question in the chat about getting a copy of the presentation. We will post the recording online, so that's how you can get a copy of the slides. Essential element number 4 is the continuity of planning. So we've been talking about this already. Post-planning is just as important as the planning session. You have to ask yourselves, what mechanisms do you have in place to ensure that the plan gets reviewed? Ano naka-embed sa routines ng mga teams para hindi nila kakalimutan lang yung plans after nung workshop? We have to really build that behavior that people are actively using the plans that they've set, tracking their measures, and then evaluating how they're doing against the targets that they've set. Usually, merong formal na mid-year ang mga companies. So that's a forcing function that will tell people to review their plans beyond the planning workshop. But the thing that maybe you can think about more is, how do you make it more part of everyday routines? Doesn't have to be everyday naman. But my suggestion is, during your team meetings, instead of creating complicated slides for every single update that you want to give, it might be better to just use the actual planning documents. Update the planning documents to say, okay, if in January this is what we said, now it's March and this is how I'm doing in terms of that goal or that target. I think mas useful yun para nagsisave din tayo ng time in terms of creating documents, and we're using what's standardized across the organization. Now, I'm curious to know, in terms of frameworks, tools, models, ano yung mga usual nyo na ginagamit in your organizations? So maybe for the ones who have been doing planning already, you have an answer to this. If you haven't done planning yet, or this is something totally new, don't worry, you don't have to answer. So let's just get a quick survey here to see if people have some frameworks or tools in mind. So please go ahead and type that in the chat. All right, let's see here. SWOT, TOWS or TOES, VPC, BMC, all right. SWOT, yes. Classic. OGSM, balanced scorecard. Direct messages to me, KPI, KRAs, lots of SWOT, okay? Pulse surveys. Oh, I'm glad you're using data. Good to see that there. All right. Good. So now we can see some of the common ones, right? Because that's the next essential element. So essential element 5 is alignment on framework. As you can see from our chat box, napakadaming frameworks that are out there. Every single consulting firm, Deloitte, McKinsey, Gartner, Burson, they'll have their own framework that they recommend. So now what, right? Honestly, there's no one perfect framework. They all have their pros, they all have their cons. The most important thing is alignment. Dapat pare-pareho kayo na nag-agree na yun yung gagamitin. If you already have a framework that you use, I encourage you to evaluate if that framework still works for your organization. If it does, then stick to it. Kasi mahirap din pag paiba-iba tayo ng ginagamit. Hindi na build yung behavior. If you do not have a framework yet, then you can decide on what will be the most suitable for your organization. My suggestion is look at the things that your classmates typed in the chat. That might be a good way to start. And then I'm going to show you this. Let me orient you on what this slide is saying. So there's this company, they're called BSC Designer, and they've plotted the most common kinds of planning tools in the visual that you're seeing here. I think useful siya in terms of getting examples of common tools. But I'm going to tell you, take it with a grain of salt. Kasi this company creates and sells their own templates. So syempre, we also don't know if they're recommending the best ones, diba? I think it's just good to look at this visual to see the variety of options that you have out there. Let's look at some of the common ones people are talking about, okay? There's SWOT or other versions of it. So, kita naman natin, diba, na SWOT is one of the most common ones. And SWOT is useful because it helps you to analyze internal factors and external factors. Okay? Another common thing that people talk about, OGSM. OGSM, objectives, goals, strategies, measures. That's what it stands for. A lot of big companies actually use this. So if you want to take a look at that, there are a lot of readings that you can find online, and they're usually pretty good readings. So OGSM is something that can really break down the internal factors. Ang thing about OGSM is complex siya because you have to train leaders on how to use it. The differences between O, G, S, and M, sometimes it can get confusing. So that's why I only recommend this for companies na siguro mas sanay na yung mga leaders magplano. If hindi pa masyadong sanay yung mga leaders magplano, this might be a little bit too complex for them. Another thing that people mentioned, balanced scorecard. So as we can see here, balanced scorecard parang nasa gitna siya, di ba? This means that it's actually something that takes these different factors into account. Balanced scorecard is actually one of the models that the top companies use dahil nga mas madami siyang tinitake into account na information. But again, it depends on your organization because sometimes that might be too complex for what you need and the skill level of the people who are doing the planning. The mistake that I commonly see with organizations is pinipili muna nila yung tool, tapos pinipilit nila yung mga tao na gamitin yung tool. That is something that can help you feel like you're using good standards. But what I encourage you to do is to first really look at ano ba yung kailangan namin and gaano ba kasanay yung mga tao. Then from there, you look at what tools can fit that scenario. So again, use a framework that fits your organization's needs and the experience level. I'll give you an example from a client that I have. So I have this client na their leaders are not so used to planning. They've been in existence for a while, but the problem is, palipat-lipat, paiba-iba sila ng frameworks. So for the longest time, wala na silang nakasanayan na framework kasi paiba-iba sila. Every team had a different way of doing planning. And so if we think about experience level, medyo on the lower side. That's why what we've done is we decided, okay, let's just not use any of the standard frameworks. We'll make one that works for us. So we made it very, very easy. Organizational goals. Yung organizational goals, 3 to 5 lang. Each goal, now all the departments will have priorities that align to those goals. And then when it comes to operational planning, each department will look at what are the outcomes that will tell me I'm doing my priorities. So pag nasulat na nila yun, siya nila ilalagay at dapat namin gawin per month para magawa yung mga outcomes na gusto ko makita. So again, diba? There's no label to that framework. That was something we created to fit the need and the experience level. All right. Once you understand the fundamentals of planning, that's something you can do. You can take the good things that work from different models and use it to your advantage. So medyo mix and match siya in a way. Essential element number 6, organized and easily accessible documentation. Once you decide on a framework, all units, all departments must use the same one. Another thing to take note of is mas maganda pag may easy access yung mga leaders dun sa framework or tool na yun. That's why I encourage utilizing online tools. Think about a Google Drive or like if you have your OneDrives in your organizations, your SharePoints, if you're on the Microsoft system, these are things that you can use para maging easy access for everyone. If you're a smaller company and you don't have those subscriptions, don't worry about it. You can create Google email, use Google Drives, and those are all free. So meron pa ring way to create those online tools for easy access. Another thing to think about is to find ways to put physical reminders around office spaces. In a lot of the big top companies, they'd usually have rooms in their floor for the team meetings. And in these rooms, you'll see that their walls are covered with tarps or whiteboards. Yung iba nga, ceiling to floor to ceiling, covered siya with a calendar. Kasi sinusulat nila dun yung mga bagay that they planned for. So that every time they walk into the office, there's a physical reminder of what they need to do and to align against. So that's something that's important because physical reminders jog people's memory. The goal here is to encourage constant recall, yung madali siyang maalala. Essential element number 7 is leadership activation. Leaders have to be able to easily and readily identify at least 3 to 5 of the organization's biggest goals and priorities. This is why it's good to not have so many goals kasi hindi siya ma-memorize and ma-articulate ng mga tao pag masyadong madami. We have to use planning to help leaders articulate the connection between those organizational level goals and their own units or departments. Kailangan, in their own words, masabi nila kung bakit importante para sa kanila yung organizational goals and how that translates to their own units. Kailangan ma-explain nila yun properly. That's why I recommend that you use the planning workshop to really give leaders time to discuss, dissent if needed, mapag-usapan nila yung pagkakaiba-iba nilang opinions, and to unite on common ideas. Sometimes, I make jokes with leaders na di tayo lalabas dito hanggat wala kayong one voice in agreement. So then that's something that kind of works as a forcing function for them to discuss differences and unite on the common ideas. Last essential element 8, is constant communication and storytelling. Kanina we said that we want documents to be easily accessible for constant recall. Effective planning goes beyond constant recall. We want people to believe in the plan, naniniwala sila na importante to and gusto ko to mangyari. And then we also want them to have a desire to not just act on the plan, but to also share that. Gusto natin na yung mga tao mismo ang magsasabi na, okay to, kaya ko to ginagawa. And they encourage other people to do the same. As you experience wins, as you notice that people are following plans and executing accordingly, it's good to keep track of those anecdotes. The more we can collect evidence of that happening, then we can tell stories about it. The most important thing is makikwento natin kung ano yung transformation na nangyayari sa mga tao because of the plans that you put in place. Another thing that you have to think about is how do you communicate those plans with the stakeholders? Kailangan naiintindihan din ng mga customers or clients yung mga plano that's relevant for them. And then something to think about is that your plan influences your employer brand. How are you communicating that plan to potential hires? Your potential hires are not yet there in your company. So how are you able to package your plans in a way that will sound realistic, but also enticing to people who are hearing about your company? So that's the power of storytelling. Mas effective yung mga plano kung hindi lang siya sinusunod at ginagawa, pinapag-usapan din siya at pinagkikwentuhan to start changing mindsets, beliefs, and behaviors. All right, everyone, those are the 8 essential elements, but something that I hope you can take away from that portion is the best planning exercise is really customized to target the needs of the organization. There's no one perfect framework, but if you have those essential elements in place, then it gives you a higher chance na maging successful and effective yung planning ninyo. Now, before we dive into the very last part, question for you so we can start synthesizing our learnings. Which of the 8 essential elements would you want to pay more attention to for your future planning sessions? Out of the 8 that you heard, meron bang isa o dalawa na pinaka-interesting para sa'yo or that you'd want to try in the future? So go ahead and maybe type that word or phrase in the chat. All right, leadership activation, very important. If you solve that, then the leaders who will sponsor you can help make things happen. Yeah, storytelling. I'm glad that's something that sticks because I think, so honestly, when people think of plans, parang boring kaagad yung nasa isip nila, di ba? Like, ang boring, ang daming Excel sheet, ang daming details, but storytelling can help make that something that's interesting and useful and compelling. I'm glad that a lot of you are saying storytelling. Okay, great. So now let's move into the very, very last part. And for this one, I'm going to tell you to, again, please take it with a grain of salt because I'm just going to use an example of something that I generally do or use for my own clients. So how might a planning exercise look like? Imagine that the organization wants a planning session with elements of both strategic and operational planning. So again, ang pinag-uusapan natin dito yung planning exercise, yung workshop mismo, okay? So I usually get requests for like a hybrid sort of strategic and operational planning. And I'd love to share with you an approach that I think maybe it might give you an idea for your own planning sessions as well. I like to think about planning sessions as a journey with 3 distinct parts. First, you want people to talk about where we are now. Kaya dun tayo sa beginning of that road, the beginning of that journey. The second important distinct part is where we want to go. So people have to define what is that end goal or destination that they have in mind, depending on the time frame that they choose, whether it's 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 6 years. What is that thing that they want to get at? And then the middle of the road is, what do we do to get there? When I think about planning workshops or planning exercises, these are the 3 most important parts na kailangan masagot namin by the end of the planning workshop. So now let's break that down. In the beginning of the workshop, I always take the time to set up the environment. Like what I mentioned earlier, it's pretty common to see companies na hindi magkakakilala yung mga tao and nagkikita lang sila during planning. So what I like to do is to create a space where people feel like I can get to know the people around me, I can learn from them, they have skills that I don't, or they have ideas that I don't, and I'd love to hear from them more. That's the kind of sentiment that you want people to have when it comes to planning. So I do spend some time in the beginning to get people to get to know each other. So very simple things like maybe sharing a trivia or asking some more personal questions not related to planning. I find that it helps break the ice. It helps people to feel like they're in a safe enough space. Next up, where we are now. So what we want to do here is for the units or departments to recap what they have done in the past year and their learnings. Companies do this in different ways. Some companies, they want each unit to present about their accomplishments. For some companies, they just ask someone, usually a leader or a member of the ManCom, to summarize the highlights of what happened in the past year and what they can learn from that. It really depends, again, on the need of your organization. And then what I like to do here is to lead the people through a collective activity so that they all evaluate the present reality. This is where I like to use the SWOT analysis. It's a very common tool. It's classic. That's why I still use it. There are some people who might say that it's outdated. It's better to use something like TOWS, so TOWS, TOWS, or SOAR. So SOAR is SOAR, strengths, opportunities, aspirations, results. So you might find some articles saying those things. I'll explain why I use SWOT, okay? So with SOAR, for example, it already gets into results. But at this stage of planning, it's the very beginning of the planning. I don't want people to think about results yet. Kasi mas detailed na yun. If you start getting people to think about results, mas stuck na sila dun. The purpose of where we are now is for people to have an honest evaluation of the present reality. I find that SWOT is simple enough to surface those thoughts. And then because the tool is simple, we spend more time discussing. So kaya nagsuswot pa rin ako. What I encourage you to do is to read up on those different tools that are similar to SWOT and then select which one would be most useful for you. So again, Some of those tools are TOS or SOAR, and madami pang iba. But TOS or SOAR, ito yung mga pinaka-common that you might hear of that are similar to SWOT. Okay? Something to watch out for when it comes to the where are we now is to make sure that the voice of the customer or the client is present. I'm not saying that you need to have a customer as a participant. So we're not saying that your client has to be in the room with you during planning. Although there are some companies now there are portions of planning where they invite clients or customers. What we're saying here is, as you do your SWOT analysis or your review of the present reality, you need to have data on what your customers and clients are saying about you. I think some people earlier mentioned you do like surveys or data analysis. Those are very important ways for you to get the sentiment of your customer. So again, kailangan may mag-share kung ano ba yung voice of the customer. And then part 3, where we want to go. This is where I usually ask the leader, the highest level leader, to first lay out their point of view on the direction. I do that because sometimes it's overwhelming for the lower level managers or even employees to verbalize goals and directions on their own. Minsan, mas madali para sa kanila na may mare-reactan muna sila before discussing. So I ask the leader to talk about it first so that it's easier to react to something afterwards. In this section of where we want to go, I always make sure that I open the space for discussion. We actually spend more time discussing here than using tools. That's because it's important that the leaders have one voice when it comes to defining where they want to go. So nasabi na natin yun kanina. If the company wants to revise or create a new mission, vision, purpose, values, I usually start with small group discussions. So why do I do that? Because if there's a lot of you talking about mission, vision, purpose, values, that's a lot of voices. And it's hard to hear what people are saying. It's hard to synthesize. So what I like to do is in groups first, they talk about their opinions. Then I train the leaders on how to do thematic analysis. So hindi nila alam na nagre-research na sila and nagsa-thematic analysis na sila. So it's guiding them to see what are the common themes they're hearing from the different groups. And maybe those common themes are the ones that they can craft into the mission, vision, purpose, and values. Something to watch out for is I encourage you to really spend time crafting the actual statements on goals and priorities. I see this a lot with clients na pag nagpa-planning sila, sinusulat lang nila yung draft. Tapos sasabihin nila, someone else will consolidate that later on. But no one consolidates it later on because no one is assigned to do it. So what I encourage you to do is to allot time na uupuan niyo siya and isusulat niyo na specifically ano ba yung statement. How do we word the goal that we want to talk about? How do we word these priorities? Para after nung planning, at least yun na yung final. There's no need to wait for someone else to consolidate or to reword the things that you have on draft. Another thing I like to do is I quiz the leaders on mission, vision, purpose, values, goals, and priorities. I'm kind of makulit as a facilitator when it comes to planning. Sometimes I would tell the leaders, I'll give you a minute, memorize the goals you just talked about, and then I ask them to close their eyes and they have to recite it. So these are just some things I like to do. I make it fun, of course, to encourage them. But the purpose is I want to make sure that if anyone asks them about the goals, they can say it. They can talk about it using the words that they just agreed on. So that might be something fun that you can try with your own organizations and teams. And then last is, what do we do to get there? This is the more operational planning part of the exercise. What I do here is I give participants time to work within their own units or departments, again, ensuring that people have the same framework. That's one of the essential elements, if you remember. Sometimes I find that I need to orient or maybe reteach the framework to people. So that's something you might want to make sure of if that's a need for your organization. What I like to do is I like to break down the working time to do some check-ins. So for example, I'll say, I'll give you an hour to work in your teams, then we'll do a check-in to see if there are burning questions coming up. And then another hour, then another check-in. So that way, you're encouraging people to look across and to look above. The thing to watch out for when it comes to operational planning is people might get bogged down by details. Ibig sabihin, dahil pinaplano mo yung para sa team mo, mas madaling mawala dahil puro details yung tinitingnan mo. You have to encourage people to look at ano bang ginagawa ng iba? Are there collaborations I'm seeing here? Aligned pa ba ako sa ginagawa at gusto ng organization? So then you need those check-ins to encourage people to look up and to look across. And everyone, that's pretty much it for how I try to handle those parts. I just have some quick tips if you're ever facilitating. So number one, acknowledge the tediousness of the exercise. You have to really tell people na it's hard, it's overwhelming, it's detailed, it's not a fun team building. So the more you can acknowledge that, I think it helps prepare. Find ways for participants to see and feel they are progressing through the planning process. Sometimes what I like to do is I create huge checklists para habang may natatapos kami, chine-check namin yun sabay-sabay and they feel like they're moving along. Next, connect plans with behaviors and ways of working. As a facilitator, you're the third-party objective person who can see if what they're saying is aligned with how they're behaving and talking to each other. So there's an opportunity for you to point out those alignments or misalignments. As the facilitator, you're holding the space for discussion. It's tempting sometimes to just keep on using presentations for planning, but I encourage you to go more with discussions than just presentations. And then again, I already mentioned this earlier, serious work doesn't have to be serious. So planning is already so serious, so tedious. You can find ways to lighten up the mood a bit. Diba? Bakit mo pa pahihirapan yung mahirap na? So try to make it feel like it's light and bearable and enjoyable even for your participants. With that, everyone, it's right on time. We're almost at the end. And so for those who are new here, what we usually do is we finish up the webinar and then we open up for questions later on. So just in case you have questions, just so you know, don't worry, meron pa tayong time for Q&A later once we end the slides, all right? So let's just do a quick check. We said that number one, we want to identify common challenges. We've done that. We said that we want to discuss essential elements. We have 8, we've done that. And we said that we want to provide examples that you may be able to use in real life. So we just did that in the last part. Now, last question for all of you. Wala pang bagong meme, so we'll keep on using Sharon. Anong balot mo pauwi today? So what insight will you take home with you from today's session? One word or one phrase? What is the one thing na you'll make sure babalutin mo pauwi? Para naman may use yung learning natin today. All right, communication and accountability, strategic planning, and in general, okay, great reminder to go back to those basics. Communication is important. Helping follow through, evaluating behaviors. Yeah, follow through, I think, is one of the hardest things to do. essential elements, communication, designing, planning for the needs of the organization, and not fancy tools. It's tempting talaga, no, to use the fancy tools because when you say like, oh, balanced scorecard, it sounds so smart. Sometimes I get tempted to do that also, but I have to remind myself that doesn't mean because it's fancy and new it's the best, you know? All right. So great, everyone. Thank you so much for talking about your insights there. If I were to summarize my insights, as always, 3 key takeaways. Number 1, intentionality is important. You have to plan to plan. Hindi pwedeng we just show up and expect that planning will work. So a lot of things happen to encourage and make sure that planning will be effective. Number 2, alignment across the organization is a contributor and a result of effective planning. So, ibig sabihin, kailangan aligned kayo para maging maayos yung planning. And pag maayos yung planning, maayos yung plans, mas magiging aligned pa kayo. So I think it's such a great way to think about how important alignment is. And then last takeaway is an effective planning exercise enables empowerment for the company, for the units, the departments, and the individuals. Sometimes we might think that plans box you in, but I hope that what you're getting from today is it's actually just a way to guide you. Once you know what has to happen, it'll free you up to be more creative. You'll have the autonomy and the empowerment to maybe try things as long as it's aligned with the plan. So hopefully that's something we can think about to make planning mean something more than just putting things to paper. So with that, everyone, let's go through quickly the things that you have to take note of, especially for certificates. So please connect with us. We have a Facebook group, Facebook page, and a LinkedIn. So please like the Facebook page so we can stay connected. Answer the evaluation form and request for a certificate using that link. Again, it's only open for 2 hours after the workshop. And then stay tuned for the next webinar this February. We'll announce all of that through the page. If you'd like to book a call with us to learn more about how we can work with you and your organization, please just send us a message. You can email us at contact.ecconsulting@gmail.com, and we'd love to have a call with you. So everyone, that's the end of the webinar. But like what we always do here, if you do not have any more questions, please feel free to leave the call, to leave the Zoom meeting. That's the end, I promise. There are no more slides after this. Please enjoy your hopefully early lunch. And then for people with questions, we can stay here until around 12 o'clock to take those questions that you might have. All right, so for those who are leaving, bye everyone. Thank you so much for being here and for learning with us. And then for the ones who have questions, go ahead. You may start just typing that in the chat and then let's go and answer them.